views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey there, welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is the program on BronxNet where we talk to journalists, reporters, photographers, videographers, anybody covering the news in the Bronx and beyond to give you some insight as to what the journalists are thinking and saying and kind of gives you an open door to what's really going on in the world. Tonight we have an extraordinary show because there are a number of main topics going on in the Bronx and in America right now, and we're going to cover two of the most important ones. One is the migrant crisis, so-called crisis, at the Mexican border, and we have a reporter who's actually down there in Texas to talk with us about that. And then in the second half of our show, we're going to talk about the rather extraordinary upset of current Congress Representative Joe Crowley by a Bronx Latina, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so that'll be the second half of our program. But right now, we go down to Harlingen, Texas, and we say to my longtime friend, and maybe yours too, Manny Fernandez. Nice to have you with us, Manny.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Great.
My heart is in Texas and in the Bronx, so it's great to. Thanks for having me on.
And I'll explain to people who might recall or might not recall. Manny works for the New York Times, and I don't know, maybe 7-8 years ago, maybe a little more than that, he covered the Bronx for the New York Times, and that's where Manny and I met. And since then, he had moved down to cover Texas for the New York Times, and he's been right on top of the border, literally, to give us some insight. So I thank you so much for joining us. Manny, you were with that first and maybe only group of reporters that got into this former Walmart where some of these children are being housed. And I'm looking at the article right here. You did it on June 14th. It published in the Times. Tell me a little bit about the process of getting through so you actually got in, and then we'll talk about what you might have seen when you looked at children and others who were detained.
Sure. The process really started for me and other reporters after Senator Merkley tried to get into that shelter at the former Walmart in Brownsville, Texas. He tried to get in. He was turned away. They called the police on him. And that whole episode really kind of brought national attention to that site. And once that happened, I was not alone. They were flooded with media requests to go in to sort of find out what was it that he wasn't allowed to see. And I think people were generally curious about it. And so I just sent in my request, and then it took several days. I think that the federal officials and the people that run that shelter kind of hunkered down and tried to decide what it was they wanted to do. And after a few days, they basically invited myself and a few other mostly national and state media outlets to tour the site. So basically, it was me sending in a request, hearing nothing from anyone for several days, and then suddenly saying, can you be in Brownsville tomorrow for a tour? And of course, I was already here, so it worked out.
Pretty easy to do. What were you allowed to do and what were you not allowed to do?
Yeah, sure. There were a few ground rules. One is that we were not allowed to interact with the children. We were not allowed to interview them. And we were not allowed to sort of disrupt any of the programs or classes that were happening. And we were also not allowed to take pictures. So we were actually told to leave our cell phones in the car. And I did. And, it was very controlled in that way. It was fairly brief. It sounds like a long time. I was there for 90 minutes. But once we got there, asked questions, got on a tour, asked questions at the end and throughout the tour, that 90 minutes really flew by. And that's kind of how it went.
Now, anybody can check up. You can look up the article. I certainly have read the article. There were 1,500 children there at the time. Maybe an overview of what you saw, and then what you thought was, let's put a value on it, what was good and what was disturbing. So, in general, what did you see?
Sure. I mean, in general, the first thing that hits you, the thing that really kind of sinks in, is the sheer size of it. Is sort of overwhelming. I mean, imagine a giant Walmart. Imagine they've gutted that Walmart, and imagine that they have built walls, hallways, bedrooms, classrooms, medical offices
Wow.
within that facility, and spent a lot of money on it. So it was, sort of not exaggeration to say it was sort of like a mini city or a mini school that was happening inside of that facility. Now, the first thing is that a lot of people, there's different images coming out and different reporting about different facilities on the border. These immigrant kids, are kept in a variety of different places throughout their stay here in America. And one of those places is Border Patrol detention facilities, which are those sort of steel cages that people have seen pictures of. They are in these sort of chain link pens, actually at Border Patrol facilities. This is not one of those. This is a shelter that is run by a private contractor. They get federal money to run it. They get a lot of federal money to run it. And it's also a state licensed child care facility. So Texas state regulators are in and out of that building pretty frequently, doing inspections, doing unannounced inspections, and making sure that what they are doing fits with state child care facility standards.
It seemed,
Yeah.
Manny, it seemed to me when you described the facility and the fact that, I mean, we know how large a Walmart is, and then that it was actually constructed inside. I mean, that's the size of building an educational complex, so to speak. That is a lot of money. You mentioned, do you know how much money it is? And that would suggest to me that this wasn't a last minute kind of like, okay, now we're going to do this. This would have to have been a planned operation, because in order to construct a facility like that, you had to know that you were going to be bringing potentially children or families in there.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been open since early 2017, and it was built as a permanent site. There's very little emergency sort of about it. You see it, and it's more than 1,000 employees. They have that huge parking lot. There's basketball courts. There's soccer, an area for soccer. When we came in, there happened to be a Tai Chi class happening. And so we were walking around. I'm doing interviews. I'm talking to the people who are running the shelter, and I hear this sort of Asian music in the background. And I turn and look, and there's basically a certified Tai Chi instructor leading the immigrant kids
Wow.
and members of the staff in a Tai Chi session in a rec room. And so, this group that runs this shelter, it's called Southwest Key. Southwest Key is one of the biggest shelter operators. They look at this site as one of their shining examples of what these shelters can be. They're very proud of it.
Well, it sounds like
yeah.
it sounds like it's well run, and if you're going to house children, or you're giving them something to do, you're helping to stimulate their growth. So I think in terms of the question I asked, that would be on the good side. That sounds like they were cared for. I assume there's a culinary facility, so they can a cafeteria, so they can have, I'd like to think, somewhat nutritional food. You want all children to grow up well. Then what? Or was there anything here that you found disturbing when you went in there and you said, gee, it kind of looks like a nice operational program there?
Sure. Yeah, no. I mean, on the surface during the tour, the conditions, I found nothing disturbing about the conditions. They are kept indoors for most of the day, and that's probably the most the detail that sort of sticks out the most as far as the conditions go. They are given, I believe it's 2 hours of outdoor time on the weekdays, 3 hours on the weekends, and plus they also get taken on field trips to parks, to churches, to soccer fields. So they have sort of a limited outdoor experience, and that was, problematic. I think a lot of people that rubs a lot of people the wrong way to sort of have children indoors all day. I'm a dad myself, and I know how difficult that can be. And so there's that. But so a lot of the problems are under the surface. They're not visible, and they only sort of come out when you start looking at different state violations, when you start sort of digging in a little bit. And one example of that is, we went on this tour, and I saw a lot of, the nice conditions. And it was only after the tour, after I got out of there, that the city of Brownsville sent me some of the fire inspection reports for that building. And they failed a couple of their fire inspections over the last several months. They passed their most recent one, so they are good as far as the fire inspection goes, but they did fail for different reasons, for sprinkler system problems. And so it's one of those things where, nobody mentioned that, during the tour.
Right. Well, they weren't about to tell you that. I mean, let's
exactly.
be fair.
Yeah, and so it sort of shows that on the surface, a lot of what they do and a lot of what I saw was fine for the kids, and nothing seemed disturbing. But that beneath the surface, there's certainly various issues, as with any other institution, that an institution that big, that has grown that rapidly, is going to have problems.
And then, of course,
they're no exception.
Yeah, and then, of course, the question, I mean, let's say you go to a nice summer camp, or you go away for a while and you miss your parents for a week or 2 weeks, and then you kind of wonder what's going on at home, and maybe you get letters back and forth while you're in summer camp. So this, maybe when you looked at it, looked like a, kind of a nice summer camp, so to speak. But then when you think about the kids don't really know when they're getting out, I'm assuming many of them have not had contact with their parents. Then you start to say, gee, late at night, a kid is sitting there by himself, male or female, and saying, gee, what is my life? What is going to happen? That has got to be a very challenging and disturbing concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing that I can add is, again, after the tour, only recently in the last couple of days, I was told about a 15-year-old boy that was outdoors in that outdoor recreation time, ran to the fence, climbed over the fence, and fled. And so they had a runaway on this past Saturday. A 15-year-old boy from Honduras ran away from the site.
So he wasn't all that happy, and he wanted to be somewhere else. I mean, that would be the reason he would take that chance.
Absolutely. As one of the local officials here told me, if it's such a great facility, why do you run away from it? And I think that's a valid
well, the
valid
kid was
question.
searching for something he can't find. Let's move on to, we could talk about this forever, and I could, one more question before I abandon it. Obviously, the president changed his policy. There's a new initiative for reunification. Do you have a sense that that is actively happening, and some of these kids won't have to run away because they'll be reunited with their families?
It is happening, but it's happening slowly. So right now, that change in that Trump policy doesn't really affect places like that Walmart, because those kids are still there. They're still being worked on reuniting with family or with other relatives. So a lot of those children are still there. They are coming out and they are leaving, but there's so many children there that the situation hasn't changed all that much for those kids.
Right.
And by the way, I do want to mention that there's two sets of boys in that one facility, and it was just boys.
Oh, just boys. Okay.
Yep, just boys. Most of the kids there came across the border on their own, unaccompanied by any guardian or relative.
Wow.
That's the majority. And then the smaller number of those kids were family separated by that Trump policy.
Right.
And so that's kind of how the population splits up.
And 1,500 was the number? That's the
that's
number
right.
the Times
And
had.
that's currently still there. There's roughly 1,500 kids there.
Wow. So then the next article that I just thought was frankly groundbreaking was the article you wrote talking about what's going on in Brownsville and you know the alarm that the president and people who follow him have sounded that if we didn't have these controls, millions of people would be flying across the border. They would be bringing opioids. They would be fueling gangs and supporting crime. And also taking jobs from Americans. You wrote, I thought, an incredibly, and that's what made me say, hey, I ought to call Manny, incredibly interesting piece about how maybe some of that stuff is not actually true, that the people on the border towns don't see the crisis that the president has been talking about. Maybe you can, for people who haven't read it, maybe you can tell us what you discovered.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate it. I basically did a story where we wanted to do two things. One is to be on the ground in a border town, asking people and looking around and asking, um, you know, is illegal immigration a problem here? Does it cause crime?
Right.
Are people taking jobs?
And people
Is it
flooding
chaos?
across the border.
Is there,
Yeah.
yes, flooding across the border? Is there gunfire? Is there problems? And then we wanted to combine that with some sort of fact checking of some of Trump's statements about border life on the U.S. side, and that was the piece. I based it out of Brownsville, and it's sort of, when you're in Brownsville, it's an ordinary, all-American place with big box stores. The Chili's and the Applebee's are packed, at nights, on Friday nights, giant movie theaters. It's just that it happens to be right on the border.
And so let's cut to the answer to that question. And at least
sure.
from what I read in that article, that the sheriff and the people there, and they are Democrats. Let's be fair. But they said we just don't see those kinds of problems, and it has been verified. And even the president's current chief of staff had testified a while ago that drugs are going through the regular ports. They're being smuggled that way and not smuggled by people who are somehow getting across the border. And that is among the revelations in that article.
Yeah, I asked the mayor and the police chief, is this a crisis for you? And they said absolutely not. There is no border crisis for crime, for loss of jobs, for general sort of chaos. There isn't that. They're happy. SpaceX is building a launching pad not too far away. There's jobs coming in. And it's not all perfect and roses, right? There is poverty here, especially on the border, on the U.S. side. There's high poverty, just like in the Bronx, really. There's middle class people kind of struggling to make ends meet.
Right.
There's problems with healthcare with the.
So we're almost out of time, Manny. But so I guess so. The overriding question and the concern would be based on what I'm hearing from you and what you had written in that article in the New York Times is kind of the entire operation based on some sort of fear tactic and not necessarily based on reality, based on what you have observed.
There is no crisis in Brownsville because of illegal immigration. They don't feel it. They don't see it. They had, 6 homicides last year. Most of those were domestic violence. Right? There's just not
people coming across the border and trying to, do something, steal, take jobs, or take over a household so that. Right. All right. And that, of course, doesn't summarize the entire situation, but it is a lens looking at one border town. Manny Fernandez, number one, tremendous to reconnect with you, and I hope we'll be able to do some of this in the future and continue just that groundbreaking work that you're doing for the New York Times. It's really important, and certainly for us who are far away from that border, and we have many immigrants, of course, here in the Bronx, it's really important work, and so I thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Great. Okay, there you go. Manny Fernandez from the New York Times. And we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. David Cruz of the Norwood News is going to join us, and we're going to talk about Bronx politics and what happened when Joe Crowley lost and a newcomer, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, won. We're going to break that down in just a moment. Don't go away.
Sure, I look cute now, but when my owner lost his job, it was rough. I was living on the street, and one night, me and this Cocker Spaniel got into it so bad, I wound up looking like an ice cream cone. I cried a little bit, but thankfully I got rescued, so I'm running, I'm jumping, all back to my old self, and I'm ready to give unconditional love, even if you put a lampshade on my head.
It's not always easy being a dad.
Do you have panda asthma too? Does that run in the family? This is the home of the most priceless kung fu artifacts.
But when you make an effort,
Dad, we're not supposed to touch anything.
Oh, sorry.
Go long, son.
it's always worth it.
Whoa, master!
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
I am gonna get you. I'm gonna get you.
Call 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov to learn more.
Oh my God, go! Oh, Shane, look out!
Hamilton was adopted from a rescue in 2008. He really likes to be around people. And as soon as I start to make my breakfast, Hamilton is right there. I get out my mat and I'm doing a downward dog and he's underneath. He's quite the pug about town. He gets invited to a lot of parties. He knows he's a pretty big deal. I mean, look at this little face. How could you not love him?
You think getting dumped by text is harsh? Try getting dumped by a tennis ball. My ex-owner drove me out to the woods, yelled fetch, and by the time I brought the ball back, he was gone. Yeah, I was pissed. But the folks at the shelter helped me let go of my anger. I learned coping skills, like taking it to the hole. Boom! Now I'm ready to fetch again. But how about I throw and you run and get it?
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. Hope you enjoyed that last interview. Fascinating inside information about what's going on the Mexico-Texas border. Right now, we stay a little more local, and we head over to Norwood and say hello to my buddy David Cruz of the Norwood News. Hi, Dave. How are you?
Doing well, Gary. How you doing?
Good. Good. So you were surprised. I was surprised. Everybody I know is surprised that Joe Crowley will not be reelected, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will be the Democratic nominee for the 14th Council District. What are your general thoughts on it?
Well, yeah, it was a pretty stunning defeat, just given the fact that, Ocasio-Cortez virtually, she has more or less zero political experience. I mean, she's never held an office before, and here she is taking on a legislative office that was held by this man for so many years, and so it was kind of like I think it was a slap in the face to the establishment party that has been, running the Bronx for, for a good long time. And it's
I-
kind of like,
I'm going to be very quick because we don't have a lot of time. I was thinking that Joe Crowley lost for the same reasons that Hillary Clinton lost, that they didn't go into neighborhoods that might have challenged him and make sure that he made his presence felt. And also, he just kind of assumed he was going to win, so they didn't, even though they had money, they didn't really campaign as hard as they should have. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think Crowley appeared to underestimate his opponent, and he was really busy trying to corral the support he needed to become the next Speaker of the House. And he obviously just was not paying attention to Ocasio-Cortez.
Mm-hmm. When I was 28 years old, I was made the program director of a local radio station up in Westchester, as a matter of fact. And I did a pretty good job. I was idealistic about the music and about some of the other things, but I was absolutely not prepared to run the business, to handle it, from a financial point of view. Of course, eventually I lost the job. How do you think a 28-year-old can do? Can she do okay? I'm concerned about having her set up in office. I mean, what do you if she does win in November, what do you think her prospects will be as a Congress member?
Well, I think that she definitely will need a good deal of support because bear in mind, I mean, the Bronx side of Crowley's district, you do have pockets of a lot of center left constituents. I mean, we're thinking of, we're talking about Country Club, parts of Throsneck. I mean, there's some pockets of, Republican voters over there, and those voters will become her constituents. And so my guess is if she really wants to try and win these guys over, she definitely has to go into these communities, and she may have to deal with a really hostile crowd. But she could also just play it safe, just stick with the constituents that voted her in, much like what other political candidates tend to do. Just have a base, and the base that can carry them to the next election.
I'm going to go one step further and say that she's got to make friends with some people who are in that same category in Congress, because she's not going to be able to go in there and turn America around by herself. She's going to need to have people around her. Jose Serrano comes to mind, Eliot Engel comes to mind, Nydia Velasquez comes to mind. They're going to have to work with her, and she's not going to be able to go in there and blow them away with her ideas.
Correct, exactly. My guess is, she's technically the minority candidate in the sense that she is a little bit too left-leaning for some of the already established congressional folks here in the Bronx.
Right.
It'll
Dave,
be interesting to see how they
go ahead and finish your sentence there. I'm sorry.
No, it'd just be interesting to see how they interact. That's come January.
Dave, I'm sorry this segment is so short, but we spent a lot of time with Manny Fernandez because he had that kind of very fascinating inside look at the border. So we appreciate your comments tonight, and we will check in with you again, certainly as this develops. And you've always been a great guest, and thank you for your time tonight.
All right, thanks, Gary.
Great. Okay, there you go, David Cruz of the Norwood News. Hope you enjoyed the show. I enjoyed the show. I learned a lot. I always say that if I learned something, it must be a good show, and I really learned a lot tonight. And so we'll see you around town. We'll talk housing on Bronx Talk Monday night. Good night.